Hi, and welcome to another in our series of Gardener Tech videos. On this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the world of Microsoft Teams, a technology that's become pervasive in many organizations over recent weeks, but one that also comes with some security considerations and maybe a number of considerations that perhaps up to now we haven't really considered and planned for. So to help me to explore that and how to make sure that we can keep full control of the data that we put inside of Microsoft Teams, I'm joined by Steve Nesbitt of Varonis. Hi, Steve.
Hey, Paul. Yes, thanks a lot for having me on the session today. So my name is Steve Nesbitt. I'm a systems engineer and Office 365 specialist at Varonis. I joined Varonis about a year ago, and before that I was working for Microsoft as an Office 365 specialist and was there for about 7 years. Previous to that, mainly in the fields of SharePoint migrations. So I've spent most of the last decade and a little bit more dealing with unstructured data and the management of it in organizations. And one of the things that we've seen at the moment is obviously a big move to Microsoft Teams. A lot of organizations, have this now as their sort of front and center to their Office 365 experience and their main platform for collaboration in the industry. And that's fantastic because Teams is a great platform. However, there are some considerations that we need to be aware of when it comes to data management and security within that platform. And so that's why I've been invited on today.
Yeah, and I think you make some really good points there, Steve. I've seen you kind of present on this topic before, and I find it really interesting. And I think one of the things that you mentioned in there as well, and something that we've certainly seen is the rapid expansion of Teams. Obviously, kind of global events have driven lots of people to have to work from different locations and find new ways of collaborating. And particularly for lots of those organizations that already use Office 365, Teams was a very natural place to go. But I think one of the things that has meant is that people have deployed Teams really quickly and have maybe not had the chance to have some of the considerations and some of the planning they might well have had around the security and the data security of Teams. So I think it's a really interesting topic for right now, and an interesting topic obviously going forward. So Steve, do you want to kind of share with us some of your experience and kind of some of the nuance to securing Teams that we need to be considering?
Yeah, sure. So that's exactly right. So we've literally over the last sort of month or so seen Teams just fly out off the shelves really and start to be deployed, but perhaps data security hasn't really caught up with it. So the agenda of today's session really is about looking at the sort of challenges of unstructured data more generally, and then working into this new world of work that we all find ourselves in. I think we all agree it's probably fairly unprecedented times that we live, and business continuity has had to be sort of front and center in most organizations' minds. So that's led to an explosion of Microsoft Teams. Now, Microsoft Teams had a kind of a design to explode anyway. The idea of the platform is that it gets rolled out and is very much managed by the users to say how many teams they want and who wants to invite them. But with that comes, a level of challenge in terms of management visibility, and that's what we're going to sort of drill into today. So I'm just going to start with some sort of high-level slides around unstructured data, and these are the sort of questions that Varonis are sort of dealing with day in and day out. First off, from a data protection perspective, I've yet to sort of meet an organization, even over the many, many years I've worked with SharePoint, that can accurately answer all of these questions straight off the bat and feel 100% confident that they understand where their sensitive data is, who has access to it, and if that access is appropriate 100% of the time. This has kind of been exacerbated a little bit now because obviously we're now looking at hybrid type environments. So we're not just looking at file servers on premise, we're looking at data storage in the cloud as well. And so when you ask someone who's a data protection officer, someone in legal, or even someone in IT, or wanting to do sort of anything like a DSARS type request, a data subject access request, where is this data? Most of the time, the best they can do is kind of an estimate or a sort of a best endeavors view of what is what data they have that aligns to this sort of request. And so to answer these questions is kind of fundamental to what Varonis does. How do we classify information and make sure that only the right people have access to it based on what it contains? Once we've done that, we can then start to then look at, okay, well, now we understand the data and the access, we can start to then look at internal audits, external classification, compliance regulations, etc., and know that we are in fact compliant. These can be, compliances and regulations that apply to everybody, like GDPR, or more industry specific. But again, how do I answer these questions if I don't know where my data is? I don't know what it is, where it is, and who has access to it. And fundamentally, the one at the bottom is kind of key as well. It's like, do I still need this data? I have terabytes of data in my environment. Is all of this stuff necessary for my business processes? And again, building on that, once I understand the data classification and who has access to it, I know how that maps to my compliance needs. I can then start to look at how I can then protect it. So if I have anomalous behavior in my environment, if I have insider threats, if I have people working or credentials that have been compromised where people are now working and doing things outside of the ordinary, am I able to alert on that? Am I able to accurately decipher when access to a piece of data is normal and when it's malicious? How do I protect against things like ransomware, malware, insider threats, and advanced persistent threats? All of these things are very, very difficult to do if you don't fundamentally understand the data. And it's ultimately the data that for most, not all, but for most cyber threats is what they're actually going for. And the final piece, and one that we've kind of been focused on a little bit more recently, is then this remote working. So now 100% of my workforce, or 90% of my workforce, is now working from home. Are they all on trusted devices? Well, not always. Are we happy with the Wi-Fi networks that they're connecting to? Can I tell if the behavior change coming in over my VPN is going to be picked up in the same way as it would if it was picked in as somebody who was sat in the office? And so all of these kind of new questions are sort of we're asking our customers. And most of the time, the answer is sort of. We can maybe answer a couple of them, partially some of the time. Now, in the new world of work, and we've touched on this a couple of times already, the acceleration towards things like Office 365 and Teams has been driven by this requirement for business continuity. So people can't sit in the office and work together. Okay, it's just not possible. We're not allowed in those environments. And if you're anything like, a lot of companies, the offices are now closed. So you're working from potentially untrusted devices and networks in a new environment, such as Office 365 and Teams, and there's a whole host of data being migrated up there, created in those environments. And a lot of the time, that's happened over a period of days, when perhaps in more normal times, it would have taken weeks, even months of planning to get to that stage. We then combine that with the fact that attacks from cyber criminals and anyone else you want to name are surging, and we've seen a lot of this within our own customers, but in the news more broadly. And you get kind of almost like a perfect storm around data management, governance, and security. So we want to try and fill the gaps in and plug these holes for visibility and management and protection within the cloud. We recognize that Teams is a market-leading solution for productivity. It's a fantastic set of capabilities that, if you're lucky enough to have in your organization, you should make the most use of. But, with that comes a level of risk, and that risk is kind of exacerbated by the fact that Teams is effectively a flat permission structure. Users are encouraged to spin Teams environments up left, right, and center. And so the scale of these platforms just increases and increases and increases. Visibility decreases in the same way. And ultimately, what does that all mean? Well, it means that the attacks that are happening more frequently have the potential to be more successful.
And I think, Steve, you make some, really, really powerful points actually in kind of that introduction, in that, it highlights quite a lot of issues around the way that we look at data in general. And I think, as you're going to share, Teams introduces some real nuance and complexity to that we're perhaps not used to working with. But I think even at that basic level, that we all talk about the importance of data, but it's so often that we come across this kind of issue of really not being aware of where our data is, how it's used, what it contains, whether we should have it at all. All of those kind of challenges, I think, are hugely important. And I think when it comes to Teams, as we're going to talk about, that is just heightened in terms of Teams adding, as I say, this kind of additional complexity that we've not thought about. And I think one other thing that's really interesting in kind of what you're covering there, and I think you're absolutely right, we've all seen examples of this, is that Teams has been rolled out really quickly across lots of organizations out of necessity. But I think what we are going to find is as we start to look at how we're going to operate in the future, I personally, I don't think Teams is going to go away. I think organizations have seen its value. As you said before, it's a really powerful tool, a really good collaboration platform. And I don't think that's going to go away as we kind of maybe start to ease our lockdowns from wherever we are watching this in the world, and start to move towards some new operating procedures. I think Teams is going to continue to play a big part of that. So I think right now is an ideal chance to really look at how we operate Teams, understand where some of the risk potential lies, and find out ways of securing it. So I mean, again, is that similar to what you expect to see, that organizations will continue to use Teams as they kind of go back to more normal operation?
100%, and I think the numbers kind of bear that out, that the genie is very much out of the bottle on this particular one now. People have to understand that Teams is designed to do this. It's designed to be a platform that grows and spreads and scales across the organization. It's designed to make adoption of Office 365 as easy as possible. Okay, that's what it's for. When Microsoft did some internal studying around, SharePoint, we realized that actually for most people, all they wanted to use SharePoint for was a place to store documents and share them and collaborate. So SharePoint does a whole host of other things, but for the majority of use cases, that's what the platform was used for. So why do I want 6 or 7 different browser tabs open to use all these functionality when I can have one single go-to client that houses all the best parts of Office 365, and I can use them around my primary use case, which is collaborating around data? So, you're 100% right. I don't see there being a reverse gear in this. Most of the time, what we see when the sort of handbrake is let off is an explosion of Teams within an organization. And the issue with that is because the way Teams works is it doesn't exist as a product on its own. It uses the back-end capabilities of Office 365, including Exchange Online, including Azure Active Directory, OneDrive, SharePoint Planner, all these different solutions that are baked into it. And so when you create a team, you're not creating a data store or a platform on its own. You're creating a window into a whole host of other services that are created on the back end. And so what that basically means is you have a situation where anyone who has the ability to create a team can create as many as they want. They can make them public or private, as in whether they can be discovered or whether they can be joined without invitation. And they can add in as many users as they like. And these can be external users as well as internal, remember. They don't necessarily all have to be internal to the network. Each time you create a Microsoft team, you create a back-end SharePoint site. And that SharePoint site basically acts as the file service repository for that team. But what's important is because there are only 2 default permission levels, owners and members, that means every document in that SharePoint site is accessible to everyone in that team. So if that team has 50 members, all 50 people can see every single file in that team without restriction. And the only way to change that is if one of the owners goes into the back-end SharePoint sites and starts messing around with the permissions. And you can imagine how often that happens. Most people just want to create the site, throw documents in there and start working. The problem is, of course, once you're in more than 1, 2, 5, 10 teams, trying to remember what you put in each team and what sensitive information was in there and who else is in those teams before you start adding in other files becomes extremely difficult. And most users just don't care, frankly. They just want to get on with work. So what you end up with is a scale challenge. Now, if a standard user creates a team a month, which is a fairly low amount, 1,000 user organization would have 12,000 SharePoint sites a year being created, okay, all of which are flat, basically from a permissions perspective. Now, Microsoft implemented another feature called private channels. Private channels allow you to have a subset of the permissions at the top end of the team. So say 10 users are in the team in general. You can have one channel where only 5 users can access that. But if you do that, you add another SharePoint site, which is separate from the one you created originally. And these SharePoint sites are invisible in the admin portals, as is their contents. What that basically means is that if you have every SharePoint site you create, in our example, has one private channel, that's 24,000 SharePoint sites a year that are being created in a 1,000 user organization. And while those numbers seem large, the reality is you can have up to 2 million SharePoint sites per Office 365 environment. And so Microsoft expect this to grow and grow and grow. And unfortunately, it's our belief, and we'll show this with the tools, that the tools that you have to control this don't really stack up in terms of managing this as that scale increases. And so you have basically a whole host of different sharing capabilities within the Microsoft tenant. You have different levels of control, from Azure AD to SharePoint to OneDrive. You have sharing links at different levels. You can set your sharing configuration up at the SharePoint, OneDrive, and tenant level. You can see different levels of visibility in Azure AD versus Teams versus SharePoint. If you have more than one tenant or organizations sharing a tenant, it becomes even more complicated, because tenant level settings may impact your organization whether you want them to or not. Now, you might turn around to me and say, well, it's okay, we'll just lock everything down and not let anybody share anything. Well, that's fine, but then they'll just go to shadow IT or start emailing things around. And do we have confidence in our DLPs to pick all this stuff up? Probably not. And so we really need to look at how these, how can we use a platform to actually understand, monitor, and report what is happening when we have our sharing set at the appropriate level. There are also a whole host of visibility challenges which are really strange and kind of take people by surprise when you talk about them, in the fact that, you know, because the way SharePoint has been architected at the back end and Teams has kind of come along later on, a lot of these services were never designed to have Teams bolted onto the top of them. So that means you get a different view of members and ownership and sharing depending on the platform you're looking at. So if I'm looking in Teams, I can see all the users. But if I look in SharePoint, I can only see the names of the groups. But if I share at the site level, I can't see that at all in Teams, but I can see that in SharePoint. And so there are all these different little challenges that have really come around, really not through any fault of Microsoft's, but just because of the fact that these platforms were never really designed to be bolted together. And I think that, you know, the inclusion of products like Delve means that if you do have oversharing issues, Microsoft provide a way for you to literally discover the fact that you've been shared things at the wrong level, and you may have access to things that you don't need. You know, you don't even need to be able to have to search for them. You can just click on Delve, and Delve will show you these are the things that you have access to if those SharePoint or Teams permissions are set too broad. And so all of these things brought together mean that actually, you know, as you roll out Teams, as you start to think of it as a major repository for your unstructured data, there is a real onus on you to have the tools in place to be able to manage and monitor what's going on.
Well, I think it's a really fascinating background as well, isn't it? Because what makes Teams so powerful and what's made Teams so valuable to organizations, particularly now, but I think going forward, you know, as you mentioned before, the genie's definitely out of the bottle with what Teams can allow you to do, is its simplicity. You know, from a user point of view, it's easy to create a team. It's easy to invite people to it. It's easy to invite external guests to it who aren't part of your organization. It's easy to share files. It's easy to have video chat. It's easy to have private chat. You know, it's easy to do all of those things, but actually the kind of back end challenge that creates, and the kind of all of a sudden sprawl of information that sits among lots and lots of different repositories inside of Office 365 must present a huge challenge. And, you know, and I think, as you're talking about here as well, that with the tools that are natively inside of Office 365, it's very, very difficult, if not almost impossible, to kind of find some of these things that are going on, and some of the challenges and potential data risk that you're creating.
Yeah, and that's only if we think of Teams as on Office 365 as a bucket on its own, as a silo. In most organizations, they're going to have data on premises as well, accessible to the same users. So if you actually want the full picture, you need to be able to look at both in conjunction with each other. So yeah, you're 100% right. But this would be a challenge even if you were just using Teams, you have nothing else. But at most organizations, that isn't the case. They're going to have Teams, they're going to have SharePoint, OneDrive, they may have SharePoint on premises, they'll have file servers, etc. on-prem as well. So they're going to have all this kind of this complexity. And I think there is a little bit of a, I don't want to say lie, but a little bit of story put out there by people in the industry that if you move all your data to the cloud, then all of these problems on premises go away.
You mean the cloud doesn't solve all of our data challenges? It's actually not really,
that we talked about at the top of this call. It does not solve all of your problems in one fell swoop. It's not a silver bullet. And all of those questions that we talked about earlier on, They're the same questions we've been asking probably for the past 15 years. And you know what? Then they're not going away. And, you know, if anything, you know, the fact that teams grow so quickly and add so many new, you know, you could argue that actually the need for a tool to give you enhanced visibility is actually greater in the cloud than it is on-prem. And what I'd like to do just to kind of show a scenario, because I think this is useful and it will add some sort of context to the demo that I show in a minute. But basically, this is the compensations team that we're going to use for our little scenario here. Nothing too extraordinary. We've got 5 members in blue of a finance team. Finance meaning that they have some, you know, access to sensitive data. They've invited one more person in the team from the company who happens to work in HR, who's Sandra. And they have an external user, Margaret, who is an external lawyer, who the only reason she's in the team is to review one employment contract. And that's it. And so as you watch this, it's interesting to maybe write these names down and so you understand who's who when I go through it and talk about them. But basically, hopefully you can see that this is the sort of scenario Teams was built for. An ad hoc team that just needs to get something done. A few people, doesn't have to be world ending, it's just 7 people, you know, trying to do their job. And creating the team and granting access is dead easy, right? I create the team, I add the people in, I choose my owners and my members. Margaret exists as a guest because she's external, and we're done. Then, as I said before, I start to then build out the channels, which in this case are general and bonuses, and I start dropping in information. And as I've said, everyone from that slide before, all 7 people have full access to every file in this channel. And so it's really easy for me to accidentally, or maybe even deliberately, start to drop information in there that has sensitive data in it. Now, it may be that I don't know that it has sensitive data in it because I'm not using a tool like Varonis to classify it where it tells me, or it may be that I do know and I just don't care, or I think this is an appropriate use of the channel. But either way, suddenly, sensitive information is now on view to external users as well as internal. But it doesn't stop there, because obviously if I go to a specific file within the SharePoint at the back end, I can then share it with other people as well. So it doesn't stop me from sharing it with other people internally just because they're not in that team. And obviously I have varying different levels of sharing control, which we talked about before. Everything from an anonymous link, which requires no authentication at all, right down to view only and other restrictions. So for example, James, who was in our finance team, there's nothing to stop him in this scenario from sharing the same files that he uploaded to the team with Emma, who isn't in the team. She then has access not to the team and all of that information, but she has access to that one file that's in the team. And if you are the team owner, you know, it's difficult to see that that has happened. And also to maybe speak to James and say that is or isn't appropriate. Likewise, if we have using, say, other parts of the team's functionality, such as the chat, James may be talking away on instant message to Margaret using Teams IM functionality. If he uploads a file, which may be part of the conversation that should be happening with the team, well, that file doesn't appear in the team. It goes into James's OneDrive and Margaret gets permissions on. So again, we're adding additional storage locations for information that if you were then a team member, you would not have, sorry, a team owner, you would not have visibility on. Also, if you promote people from, members to owners, you effectively make them the head of a security group. So a security group admin, where they can start inviting other people, change the team from private to public and back again, add in additional users, expose data, new data in channels, etc. And as we talked about before, Delve is really handy for somebody who's really interested to know what information they have that perhaps they shouldn't. Delve literally surfaces it to you. So one of the things we used to laugh about when I was at Microsoft is one of the great use cases for Delve was just to type your boss's name in. And then anything that he had shared more openly or you had permissions to, you could see. Now, there's a perfectly good productivity use case for this. It's designed to be able to show you what your colleagues are working on so that you don't duplicate their work. So if you see a slide deck that they're working on that applies to you, you can reach out to them and say, that'd be a great template for me. However, if I'm a malicious insider or I've compromised someone's identity, this is the first place I'm going to go. Show me the things that I don't even know exist. I don't need to search for them, but just show me all of the information in this network that I have access to, because the SharePoint permissions aren't set with a least privileged access model. Likewise, if I create a private team, it's not really private. It doesn't stop me from sharing outside it. And I can still invite other people in as well. So again, it's very, very difficult as an owner to really understand the boundary of what is happening within this environment.
And I mean, you can certainly see how the risk grows quickly. You know, again, you're sharing here that there's lots and lots of really valuable tools that are very helpful in terms of productivity, data insight. You know, but you can see already how it's starting to produce risk around our data security and around our data privacy. So so I'm hoping what you're going to be able to show us is how with
in a moment
with some of the tools that you guys have got, we can start to grab some control of this.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because one thing we're not doing here is casting any aspersions about the power of Teams as a productivity tool. It really is the gold standard, and I've used it for years, and it's brilliant. However, you have to be aware that the control of it is almost out of our hands by design. You know, it's delegated to the users who don't necessarily know how to use it. Now, if you have one team, it's manageable. If you're in 10 teams, when I was at Microsoft, I was probably in about 50. I had no idea what teams I was in, or what data was in them, or the data I'd put in those teams. And I do Office 365 for a living. So your standard user is not going to know. And that then filters up to how much control do IT, admins, security, compliance, data protection, all the other parts of this, how much visibility do they have in there? So some of the visibility challenges in a little bit more detail, for example, is if we share a bonus sheet to a user that's internal to the company but not in the team, we can't see that has happened within the Azure AD view. And we also can't see Emma in Teams. We can see Emma if we go to SharePoint and we drill down into the permissions at the back end of SharePoint. And Emma and Chris are only visible within SharePoint after tedious drop-down, tedious drill down, and you really have to know what you're doing. And you know, most users aren't comfortable with playing around with permissions at the back end of SharePoint. But the team members, you can't see them in SharePoint. You can only see the groups. So you have to look in multiple different places to get the view. But hang on, who's Chris and how did he get there? Well, Chris was actually shared at the team site level. So he was shared the site at the SharePoint side, not in Teams at all. So again, someone else has access to a location that Teams is using containing files. You can't see that person's information within Teams. And so without wanting to labor the point too much, there's so many different ways to control sharing. There's so many different levels of sharing that we can do within Office 365 and Teams that it becomes difficult. And so, as you quite rightly say, what I want to do now is show you what the solution is. How do we use the Varonis tools to kind of get an understanding of what that looks like? So if we go back for a second to our compensations team, hopefully you'll keep those guys in mind. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to flick over to my virtual machine. I'm just going to run some of these again, just so we have them up to date. Hopefully what that showed really was a sort of traditional view of what a normal teaming experience would look like. But what I want people who view this video to think is, what's this going to be like when I've got 1,000 of these or 10,000 of these, not just one or two? As I've said, with one or two, not such a big deal, right? We can easily police that with the inbuilt tools. But when you have thousands being generated a day, it's a lot more difficult. So one of the first things that Varonis enables you to do is have a very easy, high-level view of exactly what sensitive information is within your Office 365 and Teams environment. So again, because we're looking at Teams from a SharePoint and OneDrive perspective, we don't care about the video calls and the calendar and all the other stuff that's going on in the back end. What we care about is the sensitive information that's held in there. So at a high level view, this dashboard is designed to tell me what sensitive information do I have, what type of sensitive information do I have, who's it shared with, is it shared with external users, is it shared with public anonymous guest links? And so I can very easily start to see, okay, is this a trend that's increasing? Who is doing this kind of sharing? And start to understand whether there's a risk associated with that or not. Now, if I go back to my searching here, just get rid of my stale data event. What I can do is within the Varonis view here, is show exactly what has happened from an Azure AD perspective when a team was created. So you hopefully remember our compensations team from a second ago. Because we're linked into the APIs at the back end of Office 365, I can see exactly who has been added to whatever team within whatever time period. And I'm looking at, say, a week at this point in time. And what I can also do is use the refiners on the left-hand side to say what permissions have been added. So for example, I can see here I've got my user added. So that's someone external to the organization. And there we go, there's Margaret, who was our external lawyer that I mentioned before, and she's been added into that team. So the point here is if I want to know when a team is created, if an external user or a particular internal user is added to a particular location, in this case, compensation group, then please tell me. And I can do the same thing with SharePoint as well, if I just get rid of that. So I'm just going to rerun my search. What I'm looking at here is my SharePoint permissions over the last 7 days. And so what you'll see here is it's not just 1 or 2 teams that's being created, it's quite a few. We've got bonuses and other ones that have been created. So what I'm going to do now is filter around all the different teams that have been created. So let's just take a look down here at our compensations view. And here we can see all of the SharePoint permissions that have been added to the back end for the creation of that site. Now, again, you might think, well, so what? Well, the main reason is that if anything here is particularly important to you, any particular value that we're looking for here is, concerning, we can pull out, report on that on a regular basis. Other thing we can do as well is look at creating more and more of these kind of pivots. So we can go into here, we can look at adding additional fields into here, and basically anything that we can get from the Office 365 connection that we make via the API, we can pull into these searches. And so what this enables us to do is whenever a team is created, whenever a SharePoint site is created at that back end, whether it's a part of just a standard SharePoint site, one at the back end of a team, whether it's a private channel SharePoint site, we can pull this into these reports and get a full visibility of who has access to it and when that was created. But what makes this really interesting, though, is when we start looking at it from a point of view of other aspects that Varonis is looking at. So in the first place, we look there at standard sort of creation of teams. Well, now what I really want to know is, okay, that's great, but what I really want to understand is how does that work with the addition of sensitive files? So I can pivot around my total hit count here. And because Varonis has classified everything within those locations, it's very easy for me to say, okay, here's my highest hits for sensitive data within my environment. I can see the sites it's in. I can drill down to whether it's in OneDrive or in SharePoint, for example. Now, as you can see at the top here, our total hit is actually in this white paper, a business case for data governance. It's hit 8 times, and if I wanted to, I could pull in exactly what classifications that's hit, and I can see the events have happened as well. I can see that it's been opened. But one of the things you'll notice here is it's actually an anonymous logon. So when we talked about before, we talked about people having public access to data. This is an example of a piece of data that's in our environment that's been shared with anyone in the world who has the link. So if somebody sends me the link, I can send it to 1 million people, and all of them have access only to that piece of data, but with no authentication at all. We'll just dismiss that. So what we then have here is potentially sensitive data shared with no security whatsoever. Now, in this case, probably not a big deal because it's a white paper. Maybe this is, we wanted to get this out. But what I can do as well is I can flick over to my list view and I can get a whole host of color around what is exactly to do going on with this piece of data. So I can see all of the metadata around that, where it was shared to, what IP, what location, and I can then add these into my search. So if I wanted to say, show me everything that was shared to a particular location, maybe we come up with a blacklist location that we've looked in and we want to see everything else that's shared to that location, whether it be anonymous or not. All of these queries we can build out with ease within the Varonis platform. Now, that's kind of really useful from a point of view of kind of understanding what happens when the SharePoint is created, but when the sites are created. But what we might want to do as well is actually drill down into our locations for the SharePoint, for the team sites and the sensitive data that we have. So what we've got here, you can see, is around about 4,466 hits on sensitive content, and most of that is PII, so HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, and other various American things. But what else we've got here as well is we've actually got the ability to look at exactly what is happening within each compensation view. So in my compensation team here, for example, I've got a bunch of documents, and what I want to know is who has access to these locations? Where is that access enabled? Now, let's have a look at general. And as you probably can remember before, we had our external lawyer, Margaret, and in this case, she only is in the team to review this employee agreement here. Okay, fine. So let's just click on that. And what that will do on this side here is it will pull back everyone who has access to that. And it doesn't matter, you know, at what level they have access. If they have access, it's in here. And so we can plug some of the gaps we talked before about private channels and about various different levels of sharing. Now, as we can see, Margaret is actually in here as well, and we can easily, you know, notice that she's an external user. But because Varonis enables a bidirectional view, we can double click on Margaret here, and we can see anything that turns green in here, she has access to. And because she was added at the team level rather than at the document level, it's a classic oversharing example. She has all of this information here that she has access to, including this payroll spreadsheet, which has 4 hits of sensitive data in there. Margaret doesn't need access to that. And so this is a classic example of how using the tools, we can drill down and start to understand where we might have those oversharing lists.
And I assume she has access to that because she's part of that team. So, you know, it's a great example of what you talked about in the beginning, that actually once we've created that team, unless we're thinking about it, we're giving all of the members of that team access to all of this information, even though we haven't meant to. Is that what's going on?
Basically, exactly that, but also everything else in the future as well. The problem is that maybe the issue in this case was that was the first document added. That, you know, when Margaret was added, maybe only that document was in there. And so it was perfectly okay for Margaret to be added to the team because there was only one file. The problem is, as we then move on and add more and more files into here, nobody takes Margaret's access away. And so suddenly you have more and more information being added into a repository where basically everyone is created equal. And that includes external users as well. But even if you turn external users off, it could just be the fact that Sandra has access here and she works in HR, not finance. So again, is data being pushed in here that maybe is finance only within this particular organization? So it's really easy for these kind of oversharings to happen. And as I said, it's hard enough to police with one team. It's impossible with 10,000 or more. So maybe in our scenario, I'm a little bit concerned now about Margaret. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run a report that shows me everywhere Margaret has access. And I've filtered this by the log on there. Now, as we can see, Margaret has access to the compensation members team at that level. We've already established that. But we can also see she has access elsewhere as well. So she has access to James Shoemaker's OneDrive. Okay. The reason for that is because when we talked before, James and Margaret were having a conversation on IM. James uploaded a document. And therefore, basically, Margaret has access to that document in James's OneDrive because that's where that document now exists. Okay, so I'm significantly concerned enough. Okay, so maybe got some oversharing going on here. So what I'm going to do is drill down this time into OneDrive for Business. And I'm going to take a look at James's OneDrive. Now, obviously, the documents are in here. This is where the sensitive information is going to be. But we can see that he's got most of our 2,475, 2,194 hits of it are in his OneDrive. So again, I'm going to search for Margaret. Can't spell Margaret, so I'm just going to put in Marge. Double click, open it up, and I can see that Margaret does indeed have a whole host of access that we weren't aware of. So including access to this location here, which contains over 2,000 hits of shared public data. Now, this is obviously shared publicly as well with edit rights, which is something that we wouldn't recommend. We also have here remediation recommendations, which is a feature that Microsoft doesn't provide that Varonis does. Well, we've actually done some behavioral modeling on Margaret, and we've determined that actually she doesn't fit the profile of people who normally have access to this sort of asset. So we're recommending that access be removed. We can click on that, we can edit the permissions, we can click on the link, and we can remove it. And that shows how we can use a combination of the reporting and analytics to drill down into exactly what's happening within our environment. We use the dashboards to look at the high-level view to understand where our problems are and are our problems increasing. And then we use the analytics view to say, show me everything that is shared external. Tell me when external files are shared. Sorry, when files are shared externally, when they contain sensitive data. Show me the same thing publicly. show me where all the information with sensitive, all the classified or confidential information is being shared anonymously. And as you can see, it's our friend here, James's OneDrive, that's causing the main problems there.
And I take it one of the values here is that you can be notified of this. This is not necessarily something you have to go back and do retrospectively. This is not a once-a-week report. You can be alerted straight away when these kind of potential risks appear, so you can start to mitigate.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And we would expect people to run these reports regularly, or even filter them into their alerting, which we'll touch on in a moment. So yes, definitely start using these as a way of keeping an eye on what is happening within Microsoft Teams. But again, because of the amount of information that's going to be in there, and the fact that we expect this to grow so massive over time, we really need to be able to do as I'm doing here, which is show me the sites, show me the locations, show me the OneDrives that have all the sensitive data, so I can prioritize that reporting. So if I know that, for example, my bonuses team here contains more than double the sensitive information, I can go into here, I can take a look at the information that's held within that bonuses team. I can put those users on a watch list. I can build out alerts and reporting that's going to tell me what happens when this ownership changes, because I know that this is my biggest threat. I know that these people here control the majority of sensitive information in my team's environment. And so having that visibility enables us to prioritize this kind of view. And Varonis goes, of course, one step further, where we actually go into here as well and we say, okay, well, not only can we show you that on SharePoint and OneDrive Teams, but we can also show you this on premises as well. So we're in that hybrid view and we want to see where the sensitive information is, who has access to it, have one report and tell me, where does Steve have access to this type of data across our entire monitored estate? We can do that in a single report in Varonis. Really powerful way of managing and understanding things, but the key here is doing it with a lens of the sensitivity of the data, because otherwise you don't have any reason to treat one team more as a higher priority than another.
Yeah, and I think there's two things that kind of spring to mind with this. I mean, I think one is the way this is presented. I think for anybody who's tried to do some of this stuff natively in Office 365, there are ways of pulling some of this information, but the format that you get it in is not necessarily the easiest format to be able to kind of quickly analyze this data. And I suppose one question though that might get asked is that people will look at this and go, well, yeah, this all looks great, but obviously there's a cost associated with this. How much or how difficult would it be to get even anywhere near close to being able to natively pull this kind of information? How much could you do in Office 365? And what of what you've shown actually either would be so difficult to do or would potentially be impossible to do?
Yeah, I think if you have the full E5 solution, so you have Microsoft Cloud App Security, you have all the bells and whistles, all the security, then you can get to some of the similar reports like external and public sharing, and you can start to drill down into some of the same API information, because we're essentially pulling from the same information. The difference is ease of use and being able to use our tool, which is incredibly fast and easy to pivot along each of these different metadata streams, which is very hard to do. Anything to do with hybrid is basically off the table, where we can pull in the analysis and the user behavioral analytics of everything that happens on your estate into this one view. And yeah, I think our own user behavioral analytics as well are far more focused around action on the unsensitive data. On the sensitive data. We're not interested in what's happening on the device or the network or emails coming in, which is where obviously a lot of the Microsoft tooling is obviously focused on. I think the final thing as well is just the sheer quality of the classification that you get with Varonis versus what's out of the box in Microsoft. I worked for years with those sensitive information types and those patterns, and they're basically not that great in terms of being able to be configured, look for specific types of identifiers that are unique to your business or even your industry, but also then be able to tune them to get rid of the false positives. Where Varonis really adds a lot of value is being able to make sure that those classifications are extremely accurate. And by doing that, we make our own reporting and alerting and analysis a lot better, but we also improve Microsoft tools like rights management services, data loss prevention, cloud app security, because they're obviously then working on on documents that have been classified with Varonis, but labeled with our integration with Azure Information Protection. So we can actually work with Microsoft Azure Information Protection labeling to actually inject those labels into documents that have met our classification requirements. And so by doing this, you get the best of both worlds. You get the Microsoft wider set of tool capabilities that look at, you know, a much broader set of security concerns than Varonis, but you get Varonis doing what it does best, which is spending its time looking at what is happening to the data assets and how we then able to manage, alert, and provide visibility into those. Final thing I'll just touch on very quickly, because I don't want to run too long, is the final piece that this has come in, and right back to the beginning of the slides when we talked about this, is then we've built out alerting around specific issues with Office 365. So if we look at, say, for example, the kill chain, if we see OneDrive, SharePoint being used to exfiltrate data, well, we've built specific alerts to pick those up. So we can see, for example, where sensitive information, for example, has been shared externally via OneDrive. Is this the first time that's happened? And as with everything else that we're doing, we jump into this analysis screen and we can start to see, you know, some of the issues around that area. But one of the interesting things here from our scenario perspective is that the first person to pop up here is Zoe. And as we talked about at the beginning, Zoe is one of the people who is now a co-owner with our team. So maybe somebody we want to take a look at. So if I jump back to my dashboards again, I can actually see Zoe here as an alerted user. And again, we have two types of alert within our dashboard, within our alerting platform. We have threshold-based alerts, and we have user behavioral alerts as well. And Zoe's triggered a variety of these within the past few days. And so we can open up and take a look at who is Zoe. So, okay, so we know Zoe's part of our compensation team. I'm going to add her to the watch list because she's actually flagged quite a few different alerts. I'm going to look at the alerts that she's flagged. And so I can see here, for example, we have that file shared externally alert we looked at a moment. But actually why she's been pushed up the tree a little bit in terms of concern is that we've also got some location alerting as well that's been fired off. So we can see that alongside you know, the fact that she's been sharing some information externally, she's also been doing it from locations that are, you know, either impossible from a travel perspective or unusual. So in this case, she's got, for example, alerts in Germany and the United States within 44 minutes of each other. But what's really pushed this up is the fact that she's an account that hasn't been logged in for at least 30 days. She's on the watch list. We've just done that ourselves. She's triggering other alerts around stale data, and she's doing this from geolocations that are abnormal. This is all starting to sort of raise a bit of a red flag. And we can drill down into then all of these different alerts that have been triggered, events that have been triggered on Zoe that are starting to make us realize, you know, why this is something that's concerning. However, what I maybe decide to do now is say, okay, none of this is making me very happy. So what I want to do is I'm actually going to look at all of the events for Zoe. So what I'm going to do is show me everything that Zoe's done on our platform over the past day or so. And again, the power of the platform just enables me to add in all of these filters, you know, really fast, really easy to do, especially if you can type. But I can add in Zoe here, add in the identities. Obviously, these would normally be merged. Search for that. Show me everything on everything that Zoe's done on all our servers and services over the last 2 days or the last day. Flick it into a table view. Look at the platform. And I can suddenly start to drill down into everything that's happening with a particular user. Now, obviously, this is a demo environment. We don't have everything filled out, but in real life, you'd see a lot more information around the events, etc. But we can see, you know, it's log-on information in Azure Active Directory, which we'd expect. In SharePoint Online, we can see, for example, it's more file modification, file opened. And again, we can then drill down, add these things into search, and start to then pivot around exactly what files she opened, when, and why. All of this kind of forensics is available to you with the tool. The reporting and scheduled searches is how you automate this. So if you want to take this away from being something that you use every day to do this kind of analysis, and you just want to be reported on, where new teams are created, who created them, what do they contain, are they shared external or anonymously, those kind of high-level threats, we can run those reports and fire those alerts. But we'd like to think that you'd use a combination of the various tools that I've showed you today to be able to really get a handle on your Microsoft Teams deployment.
And I think, Steve, that it again hugely powerful stuff, because certainly for me, the almost the first element that you have of any kind of data strategy is this requirement for insights. You need to know how your
Indeed.
data is being used, who's accessing it, what it contains, where it's going. Because I think without that, it's very difficult to build a strategy around how you use your data productively, but also how you build security, how you build governance, how you build compliance. So I think that's really impressive stuff.
Yeah. And so basically, all of that is something that's going to happen many times within your organization on a daily basis once Teams gets rolled out. The analogy I use, and it's a little bit tortured, is if Teams becomes a bit like the Wild West, what you need is a sheriff, and Varonis becomes that sheriff. And effectively, the sheriff doesn't tell the town what to do. The town sets the rules around how people are supposed to behave, and the sheriff makes sure that they stick within those rules. And that's exactly what Varonis is doing. We're not telling you what data should be sensitive. We're telling you what it is based upon your rules. We're not telling you who should have access. We're saying these are the people that do. And we're telling you when someone who's not supposed to or never has before is accessing what we would probably term the crown jewels of data within your environment, because we know that is what the attackers are after most of the time. The final thing I just want to touch on very briefly is that with Varonis, it's all about the data. If there's one thing to take away from this, it's all about that bullseye in the middle. We start with the data security. We understand what it is, where it is, and what normal access looks like. And then we work outside from that bullseye in the center out to the side to provide you with that analysis. And the way that we do that is link into the AD and other telemetry at the back end I talked about. A lot of cybersecurity companies work the other way around. They look at the perimeter. They look at everything that's happening with emails and network and device and everything else. We're focusing fundamentally on that data in the middle. And then we go through with our customers what we call an operational journey, which is we help them understand, deploy these tools, get the classification working, operationalize everything, get it to a point where it's automated, so that we can then turn around in a year's time and turn around and your internal reviews, your compliance audits, everything else become a lot easier. And we also ensure that a platform like Teams doesn't get it completely out of control. The final thing I'll leave you with just before I stop is then how do we do this? Well, the first sort of point of call that we have with all our customers is a data risk assessment. And this is where we come into the customer, we install the software, we do an API connection up to Office 365, or we connect to your on-premises filers, or both. And we basically produce a report which tells you all of the information that I've been talking about today. Basically, those dashboards at a high level are the information that we give. And this is really powerful for organizations who know that they might have a problem, but perhaps don't realize how big a problem that is. So you can get some initial value directly from Varonis, and this is a free exercise. We'll tell you, where your files are sensitive on premises in the cloud. We'll tell you where you have over permissive access, and we'll show you and help you develop a roadmap to fix it.
Well, Steve, I think I think that's been a fantastic insight into some of the risks that come with Teams. I think some of the challenges that Teams present that people probably, and I know certainly the first time I saw you present that was not something that I was familiar with, and some of the risks and challenges it presents. So, Steve, thank you very much. Really appreciate you sharing your time with us today, and we look forward to having you do a future tech video with us at sometime in the future.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
So if you've enjoyed this video today, then please look out for further Gardener Tech videos coming soon. And if you have any questions on the content that Steve's covered today, or any of the things that you've seen, and please reach out to your Gardener Systems contact or fill in the contact form on our website. So until our next Gardener Tech video, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.